seminar series, just to give a quick background, began in 2019, and I suppose a very dubious silver lining of COVID and the attendant lockdown is that the virtual community seminar series means that we're able to welcome more people to the chat, to our talks, which is nice. And thankfully we don't need to do the usual what to do in an event of a fire alarm spiel, but I would like to mention a couple of housekeeping things first. So first is to say that, as I've said, this is our first virtual event, so please bear with us as we manage any technical glitches. There have been several behind the scenes trials ahead of today. So fingers crossed all goes smoothly, and thank you to everybody who has helped behind the scenes with sorting that out. Second, just to reiterate again, this will be recorded and posted on the university's YouTube channel in case you want to revisit anything or share the link with anybody else. But also do just be aware that this is being recorded. There'll be time for questions at the end of this talk. So if you have a question or a comment that you'd like to make, please can you add it to the chat box at the side, just so that we're kind of not navigating everybody trying to raise their hands and figuring all that out and muting and unmuting everyone. It's probably easiest if you just pop your question in there and then I can kind of put them forward to Ashley at the end. So on to today. We are pleased to welcome Ashley Cole to present on her work on the Black Lives Matter movement. Ashley is in the final stages of her PhD studies at Birmingham City University, so we thank her for taking the time to come and speak to us today as she navigates all the stress of the start of term and writing up. Ashley's research focuses on social movements, leadership, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and today she'll be presenting on Symbolic Protest, case of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. So I shall hand over to Ashley. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, guys, just bear with me. This is kind of like the first time of me doing this without presenting live. But yes, I am in the final stage of my PhD. I'm due to submit next month, and I'm at Birmingham City University. And today I would just like to talk to you about Black Lives Matter, and more particularly, how did Black Lives Matter manifest from earlier Black social movements, and then discussing some aspects of Black Lives Matter that you may or may not know about. Okay, so over the last couple of months, we've had the resurface of Black Lives Matter, and a lot of this has to do with the fact of George Floyd. If you guys don't know, George Floyd was a police officer knelt down on George Floyd's neck for approximately 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and that led to his death. And this went viral. So protests erupted worldwide, and within these protests, people were saying Black Lives Matter. And this is just a visual map of basically how the protests just manifested. So everywhere in the US, there were protests, and definitely protests in Europe, and just all over the world. And this brings us back to that whole essence of what is Black Lives Matter, or the symbolic nature. What is Black Lives Matter? So before we get into that, I just want to talk a little bit about us understanding what is a social movement, because Black Lives Matter is a social movement. So before we get to that, I just want to go and dive into some details about that. So when we think of social movements, we kind of think of collective identity. Usually a social movement happens because there's something that's going on in society that a group of people do not like. It's like they want to enact social change. And it usually doesn't always happen in a vacuum. It usually happens over time, that there's a conflict out in society and people want to change that in society. And usually people get involved in a social movement because they want to achieve certain objectives, or B, they want to satisfy their needs. To satisfy their needs to be in this identity of collective identity. If I'm going too fast, please let me know. But getting to that, when it comes to social movements, we get to Black social movements, because Black Lives Matter is a Black social movement. And prior to that, there has been a lot of social movements throughout history, a lot of Black social movements throughout history. Usually a lot of social movements usually diverge from pre-existing networks. And what that means is basically movements kind of build off on one another. They usually take ideas, they take slogans, they use that from old social movements and they bring it up to new social movements. So what I like to say is the knowledge from the past serves as a basis for the future. And one of the things, before we hop into Black social movements, one particular thing that we have to make clear is about the Black church. Now, the Black church is very significant when we talk about Black social movements, because the Black church was kind of like the first organizational hub of life from slavery and onwards. So what that means is that if you were lucky enough, your slave owner will allow you to go to church, and you were allowed to go to the Black church. And in this situation, a lot of slave rebellions usually happen because of the preachers and the pastors of churches, because they had the knowledge. They could read, they could articulate the Holy Bible and ensure that there's like saying that, oh, there's a conflict out there. We don't want to be in slavery anymore. So in this, they were able to kind of bring in a social movement, but it was just in a different scale because you're talking to people that were slaves. So then the real social movements, or the social movements itself as what we put knowledge on today, kind of started up from the civil rights movement. And with the civil rights movement, you see a lot of collective action that goes on. You have a group of people who wanted to get rid of segregation in the South, in America, and the whole objective was for them to pass civil rights laws. And for the most part, the civil rights movement was very successful. It was successful because these laws were passed by 1964. And the civil rights laws means that everyone should have civil rights in America. Okay, fair enough. But to other people, the civil rights movement was kind of a failure because in urban cities in the North, they were already desegregated and racism still continued. So like places in New York, Chicago, California, there was no segregation there, but there was a lot of still institutionalized racism. The Black community was still very impoverished. There was just a lot of racism. So in this, it's like, oh, we have these civil rights laws, but things are still the same. So then you move forward and you get to the Black Power era. Now, the Black Power era, I would like to say this is definitely a big moment when it comes to Black social movements. Not only do you have this whole social movement of the Black Power era, but you also have the political slogan Black Power. And Black Power was basically about self-determination. It was basically encouraging the Black community that they can have their own, that you can have your own houses, that you can have your own education, that you can have your own place of business without having to use the government for means. And this kind of stuck around for some time. The Black Power era also dealt with other organizations. There's a lot of organizations that formed with the Black Power era. You had the Black Panthers Party. You also had the Black Power organization itself. There was a series of conferences that went on that they basically used this umbrella term, Black Power, but it was just basically them bringing together, saying like, oh, this is our collective identity. This is what we're going to do, ensure that we have these civil rights that were enacted years prior to, but they're still not being utilized because there's still a lot of institutionalized racism. But the Black Power era was very significant. You also have that emerged out of the Black Power era, you have Black feminism. You had a lot of women who worked in the civil rights movement. They worked in these Black Power organizations, and they just kind of branched off. They still used the Black Power slogan. It was just now it was time to say, hey, we are women and we deserve to have a place at the seat of the table. We are going through things too. So a lot forms under this Black Power, but in comparison to Black Lives Matter is a slogan, Black Power. Black Power was heard everywhere. It was done from celebrities. It was in the music. It was in movies. It was at national games. Black Power was very significant. And then we get to this era of, I would say approximately around the 1990s. You get to this era, we're building up towards the 1990s and the 2000s. You have, I like to call it straight out of America. And I would like to call this a significant time of police brutality. And in this, you have certain things that are leading up to Black Lives Matter. And in this, you have the Rodney King beating in California. This is very significant in America because this was actually shown. It was a video, like CCTV video, and people saw police officers beating an African American male in California. You also have Bill Clinton, who becomes president, and he enacts a three-strike rule. And what this three-strike rule basically says is if you have gotten in trouble 3 times by the police, you go straight to jail. Okay, fair enough. However, if you live in an area that has a lot of institutionalized racism, you're more than likely to get stopped or to get searched often, and you've already taken over one of your strikes. So this is becoming where mass incarceration starts to really just flourish in America. And in places like New York, you have to stop and frisk, where if a police officer sees you, they are able to stop and frisk you right there on the spot. And it just depends on how the police officer is at this point. Because then it goes back to the three-strike rule. If you've probably been stop and frisked 3 times, then you automatically are probably going to go to jail. And that's where we have this thing of mass incarceration. Now we lead on to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter. I like to say Black Lives Matter is a protest, a movement, and an organization. Some people kind of think of Black Lives Matter as just a protest. They're like, oh yeah, there's just a protest or a movement where people just can constantly just say Black Lives Matter, but it's also an organization. So Black Lives Matter, just some background history. It started in 2013 from a Facebook post. You had a co-founder, Alicia Garcia, and she basically posted Black Lives Matter at the end of a post after George Zimmerman was acquitted of killing Trayvon Martin. Now, Trayvon Martin was 17 years old. He was in Florida. George Zimmerman there was a scuffle that happened, and unfortunately, Trayvon Martin was shot. There was no videos, there was no pictures. So we don't necessarily know exactly what happened, but we know that Trayvon Martin was unharmed. So through, like I said, pre-existing networks, Alicia Garcia, she works in other social justice organizations. So that hashtag Black Lives Matter was kind of shared, through social media at this time, but it really didn't spark up until 2014. So 2014 comes around and another teenager gets shot by the police. And Mike Brown, this is in Ferguson, Missouri, in 2014, August 9th. And what's significant about his particular case was that his body was left on display for hours. The community basically just saw him lying on the floor. And by this time, social media became very popular, and the media itself, the news media, newspapers, everyone was just enraged that was in Ferguson, that it just transcends to all the areas in the US. And finally, the coroners came and they picked up Mike Brown's body. So people were on social media just typing hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter everywhere. And by this time, this had spread worldwide, where there was protests everywhere. Like the picture that I posted before with George Floyd, there were protests everywhere. And a lot of questions were left unheard. Would Mike's body be left on display in another neighborhood? Would this even happen in another neighborhood? And there was a series of other things that were going on. So while Mike Brown's situation was going on, there was another situation in California at the same time. There was scuffle between them and a police officer, another African-American male, and that ended in another death. Then a viral video shows up in New York of Eric Garner. Eric Garner was choked by a police officer. And this becomes a viral video. So you also had another hashtag, I can't breathe. But Black Lives Matter still became significant with people posting that particular hashtag. But from here, there's a series of different police attacks that starts to go on. And by this time, people are just outraged. There's just protests on protests on protests everywhere in the US because there's something wrong in the system at this point. And I just like to throw this out there with this little picture, just showing a little bit of how things are seen. It was like, oh, okay, why are police killing African Americans? That is the main particular situation. A lot of them are unharmed. So what is going on? Can you guys hear me? Okay. I think the internet, my internet just says that it says that it went offline.
No, I
Okay,
can
sorry
hear
about
you.
that. But yeah, just a little. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, my internet just clicked off on me. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. But going back to what I was saying, yeah, these pictures just kind of show a visual representation of what is going on at this time and why you have this Black Lives Matter become so significant. It's so symbolic at this point. And then it leads to the movement of Black Lives Matter. So first, you have the protest that starts up in August 2014. Now the movement starts to spark up. And the movement of Black Lives Matter basically was people coming down to Ferguson, Missouri, and they were coming down to protest everything that had happened with Mike Brown. And one of the main things that the first organizational work of Black Lives Matter was to have freedom rides. So there was freedom, it was Ferguson uproar and Ferguson unrest that had happened. That's what they had initially called it. They necessarily didn't say freedom rides to Ferguson, but there was buses that had went to different areas in the U.S. and they picked up people who wanted to come down to protest for Mike Brown. Mike Brown's trial started November 2014. The police officer was acquitted. However, individuals that were actually there at the protest decided that they wanted to continue on the work of Black Lives Matter. So this is kind of really starting up the organization of Black Lives Matter. So the organization of Black Lives Matter, it starts in 2015. And it was founded by Arlicia Garcia, who started the Facebook post, and also two other people, Patricia and Opal. And they both kind of formed together and said, okay, we're going to create Black Lives Matter. But as they did this, they expanded out to include chapters. So there's a national organization of Black Lives Matter that's in California, Los Angeles to be exact. And then you have approximately over 40 chapters of Black Lives Matter. Now with this, it's a global network. There are chapters in Canada and there's chapters in the US. Okay, and what's significant about Black Lives Matter, a lot of people always tend to focus on the leadership. The leadership is different than other Black social movements, and meaning that there's no spokesperson. There's no Martin Luther King. There's just a group of people who come together and say, oh yeah, we're part of Black Lives Matter. And the objective is to have a leaderful structure. And what that means is that many people in an organization can take up leadership roles. So if you're good at something, you can take on that role. It doesn't have to be assigned to you particularly. However, there are rules and legalities that come with being in the organization of Black Lives Matter, as in the chapters have to abide by the rules. And these rules are basically set for the mission statement and principles that are located on the Black Lives Matter website. So from this, Black Lives Matter is legally binding. There is a paid staff at the national organization, which is in California. Like I said, the affiliated chapters, they have to abide by this mission statement. And Black Lives Matter is a public-private organization. They have a fiscal sponsor that is a nonprofit. So the fiscal sponsor actually receives the money, and from the money, money from donations, and that money trickles down to the national organization, which trickles down to the chapters. When it comes to the chapters, there are affiliated and unaffiliated Black Lives Matter chapters. So trying to explain it in the best way possible. So there are people that say they are a social justice organization and they call themselves Black Lives Matter, but they have no affiliation to the Black Lives Matter national organization. But there are also chapters that say they're Black Lives Matter chapters and they are affiliated. They are part of the network. However, overall, Black Lives Matter chapters are autonomous from the national organization, which means that they can have their own leadership structure. They are able to have their own, if they want hierarchy, they can have hierarchy. If they want a leaderful structure, they can have leaderful structure. If they want relationships with other social justice organizations, they're allowed to do that. And also, not every Black Lives Matter chapter deal with the same issues. So there are some Black Lives Matter chapters that just deal with education. There are some that deals with police brutality. There are some that deal with women's rights. Sorry about that, the computer's going faster. Yeah, there's some that deal with women's rights. So not all Black Lives Matter chapters are just for police brutality. And a lot of that comes down to this structure of how the National Black Lives Matter structured itself. Like I said, there's no spokesperson. It's a leaderful structure. Now, when it comes to chapters that are unaffiliated, there's a lot that goes into how this is possible to have Black Lives Matter chapters that are affiliated and Black Lives Matter chapters that are unaffiliated. And one particular thing is you can't take ownership of a slogan. So hashtag Black Lives Matter is a slogan, and anyone could be Black Lives Matter. Also, there was a case that came up that said that a court case that actually went to the courts, and the courts agreed that people have been organizing under the name Black Lives Matter for years. So you can't just say, oh, I'm Black Lives Matter, and this organization is Black Lives Matter. There's also the fact in America, the legalities, and part of that is the LLC. So with the states in America, if you have an LLC, let's say in California, that LLC, you would have, if you want to go to Arizona, you would have to make another LLC to make sure that that organization is legally binding in all states. So that's another reason that the LLC doesn't transfer from one state to another state. But it also goes back to the national organization of Black Lives Matter. They have made it a way to where it is kind of like decentralized in a way. I like to say it's decentralized in a formal way because there are legalities and there are formalities to being in Black Lives Matter. However, it's still decentralized. Also, at this point in time, Black Lives Matter, the organization, is transitioning into a nonprofit organization. So it's just not there yet. Like I said, they have a fiscal sponsor, and the fiscal sponsor is a nonprofit organization at the moment. But there is a point in time that there will transition completely over to a nonprofit organization. Okay, and going back to the unaffiliated part, there are people that are associated with Black Lives Matter that is not part of the organization. And for one particular person, DeRay McKeeson, he actually is not part of the organization. I actually had a conversation with him, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I was in Ferguson, I protested, but I have nothing to do with the organization." And a lot of the names, if you type in Google and you just type in Black Lives Matter, a lot of those names are not associated with Black Lives Matter, the organization. So once again, there's that complications and those challenges of us understanding what is Black Lives Matter. Because like I said, it's a protest, it's a movement, but it's also an organization. And all three of those things they're similar, but they have their differences. And it comes back down to the slogan of Black Lives Matter, why there's so many differences in Black Lives Matter, or the hashtag itself, hashtag Black Lives Matter, that it can be a protest, a movement, and an organization. Slogans and social movements, like I was talking about with Black Power, how it was an umbrella term. It encompassed a lot of things, and a lot of people were able to say Black Power, just like a lot of people are able to say Black Lives Matter. But usually slogans are symbols of the movement. It's like you're framing the battle with this particular movement. So Black Lives Matter is framing this battle that, hey, Black lives do in fact matter. And slogans are basically, they're presented in everyday life. If we were to go on social media, we go on our YouTube very popular for that. And we see slogans all the time. We see different places use slogans and to get us to understand more about what that particular organization is trying to do. So when I think of Black Lives Matter or when I think of Black Power, I think, oh, these are definitely symbolic protests. These are symbolic slogans. Not just the protest itself. It's because you're able to use these names. Oh, Black Lives Matter. You know, if you think about the things that have happened that have manifested with George Floyd, you have a lot of businesses now. They're like, oh yeah, we agree with Black Lives Matter. But it's like, do you agree with the protest? Do you agree with the movement? Or are you agreeing with the organization? There was a lot of businesses that donated to Black Lives Matter. Okay, are you agreeing with the people that are protesting the movement? Or are you agreeing with the organization? Those are a lot of questions that come into play when there's slogans involved, when the slogan is very popular. And a lot of this comes with the internet age. identity in the age of social media. You know, like I said earlier, we talk about this collective action that comes down with social movements. And with social media, you have these weak ties, or people can come together and they can collectively identify. So you have a lot of this on like Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, all these different outlets, YouTube, where people are like, oh yeah, I am for Black Lives Matter. Or I see a lot of influencers and they're just like, yeah, I am for Black Lives Matter. But it still brings us to that question. Well, is it for the protests? Is it for the movement? Or is it for the organization? However, in hindsight, this technically still helps the movement itself because you can have offline and online activism. So Black Lives Matters continues on, as in we are now in our 6th year of saying Black Lives Matter. And social media, like I said a while ago, is just social media just provides that platform. It gives you that collective identities. It's telling us like, oh, through this hashtag, we can sit here and say Black Lives Matter. But do we really know what that means? What does Black Lives Matter means? And coming from these pre-existing networks, Black Lives Matter encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses Black power. It encompasses civil rights. It encompasses Black feminism. It encompasses a lot of things. It encompasses institutionalized racism that has been going on. This hashtag is symbolic because it shows a face for everything. Right now, everywhere you go, there is a sign that says, oh, Black Lives Matter. There's posters, there's anywhere you go in the newspapers, what is those things overhead, there's always something that says Black Lives Matter, and that's what makes it symbolic because it's still sticking with us. No matter what we think, when we see something on TV, when it's something about racism, we are instantly like, oh, Black Lives Matter. It doesn't cross us one day to not say Black Lives Matter. And that's how symbolic slogans are, and symbolic how slogans inform a social movement. So going back to that, it's still identifying Black Lives Matter beyond a slogan. Because as I said, Black Lives Matter is a protest, it is a movement, and it is also an organization. And though they may intertwine with one another, they all represent their own identities. And that's something that we have to look forward through as we continue on to know about Black Lives Matter. Or if we continue to post, oh, you know, when we do a hashtag talking about police brutality, oh, hashtag Black Lives Matter. But what am I really saying? What does Black Lives Matter mean? Am I there just protesting? Am I there for the movement? Or am I there with the organization that is a social justice organization that is down in the communities that are helping ensure certain particular issues are not manifested in their own communities? So my final thoughts that I bring this up to you as you go home today is thinking back on what is Black Lives Matter? Where do we go from here? How do we ensure a slogan is more than just a slogan? How do we tell others that, oh, you know, oh, I see that you're saying Black Lives Matter, but it's more than just you saying Black Lives Matter. Like I said, it is the protest, it is the movement side of Black Lives Matter, and it is the organizational side of Black Lives Matter. And just a little side piece. These are, in the last, like, I would say 6 years, these are 6 or 7 years. This is all the names of people that have been unharmed, that have been killed by police in America. Okay. And yeah, I am done.
Thank you very much. That was really, really informative. And I think that last slide, particularly kind of highlighting all of the unarmed victims, was really, really powerful. So if people have questions, we do actually, yeah, we have time. So if people have questions and they want to kind of start typing things in, we can start dealing with that. I had a couple from folks who couldn't make it today. And one of them, I think you were just starting to touch on there, was really what action can people take? And I know that's something that you talked about in one of the pieces you've written this summer, but is there something that you could share a bit more detail about, like proactive things that people can do?
You know, when I think of this particular situation, I think coming back into a different narrative. I am African American. I am from America. So when I think about this, I always say the best advice that I would give people is kind of ask people about their experiences. I think that's the number one thing. So before you try to understand or understanding Black Lives Matter, it's just asking about experience. You know, just saying, oh, you know, Ashley, what is it like going to the grocery store? Oh, Ashley, what is it like walking outside? Oh, what is it like communicating with a police officer? I think once you form those basic questions and get those answers, then you will understand why this movement is symbolic, if that makes sense. And then you can kind of move over to say, oh, you know what? Now I understand why people do the way people do certain things. And now I understand. Now I'm getting a full picture. I feel like over the summer there was a lot of, oh, you know, there's just people protesting, there's people vandalizing, especially in America. So right now, as I'm here and I haven't been to America in a while, I'm seeing people protesting, people like looting and rioting, which I do not agree with that. I'm like, you know, you don't have to go that far. However, it was mostly them showing that, oh, you don't listen to us when we're peaceful. You only listen to us when there's violence. And this is really going back to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, that was very radical. Like people think, oh, they were just peaceful, they just marched. No, the civil rights movement for its time was extremely radical. That a lot of things had happened, but we only get to see another side of it, like, oh, okay. So I would think like, yes, Black Lives Matter right now seems very radical, but I think going back to how can we be active and proactive is just asking questions. Just ask those uncomfortable questions, and then you can move forward to say, oh, okay, now I know what to say or where to go from here.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. We've just got a question here. Okay, so got a question from David. He says, thanks for an interesting talk. With the anonymity of social media, I was wondering if you think the presence of Black Lives Matter iconography and the ubiquity of their message on social media is potentially constrained by social media encouraging a form of slacktivism, wherein users view voicing their support through a tweet as being enough. In other words, does social media potentially lead to breadth of support without depth of support?
You know, like I talked about when you had unaffiliated BLM chapters, there's a lot of things that people don't know about that, because I had to learn myself because I was getting a little bit confused. And then you also find out that, oh, you know, if you type in a name and it says Black Lives Matter, these people aren't necessarily for the organization. So it social media is like 50-50 right now. I would say like 50-50, but I do say sometimes it does hurt. It hurts it because there's people that just don't know. People don't understand about the protest, the movement, the organization. And because they do not understand this, they're willing to say whatever they want to say. And you're not really getting down to the bulk of what is really going on. Like in the articles that I have written, I've written an article from The Conversationalist and Discovery Society. And I talked about how there was Blackout Tuesday. So in June, we have Blackout Tuesday. And it was just like, everyone thought it was to show you the support for Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter had nothing to do with that. In fact, a lot of people from the chapters went online and said, do not post that. That is basically getting us out of the conversation. It was done from a record label. So imagine a record label actually was just like, oh yeah, we're gonna do Blackout Tuesday, yes, today. And then Black Lives Matter is like, what are you doing? Like, you're legitimately hurting our cause at the moment. It's like, it's not necessarily you're hurting it, but you're drowning out our message. So there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to social media, especially right now. If we decide today, like everybody in this group, let's start a social movement right now. The first thing we have to think about is like, oh, what is our slogan? What is our hashtag? How are we going to put this in there? But then it's like, if I share this hashtag, then your friends share this hashtag, then their friends share this hashtag, things get lost in conversation. And that's how it's becoming with Black Lives Matter. Things are getting lost in conversation. You're bringing up stories that have no justifications. But because it's popular, it's trending, oh, a celebrity might have said it, then, oh, yeah, that's Black Lives Matter.
Thank you. I think that's something that I know we've had a chat about before, that this kind of what is actually part of the movement and what's kind of just using the slogan, and whether that can be damaging or whether it can have any positive influence. So I think that's really interesting to consider, and thanks for your question, David. So we have another question here from Lauren. She says, thanks so much, Ashley. Although I appreciate we don't have endless time, what are your overarching thoughts about American politics at the moment? Are you hopeful?
Whoa. Oh boy. That is a sticky situation right now. Boy. I just don't know what to say. I think right now, actually, going back into my older degrees, I actually do have a degree in political science, and I was in the political field for a while before I switched over to sociology. So when I think about politics, I always say for myself, I always look at what policies are being enacted. Well, for my situation right now, which president is, or even not only president, but which governor is serves me? Like, what am I going to do? And I always feel when it comes to politics, I feel like politicians, they never have a 10-year plan. Everything they do in America is just like, oh yeah, this is today. It's like they thought about it today and they're just like, yeah, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do that. And I'm like, you know what? For politics to actually sustain itself, I want to see a 10-year plan. Not even 10, but maybe a 20-year plan. Now me, I don't have children yet. One day, hopefully, I get married and have children, but I want to know what happens in those 10 years. What happens in those 20 years? When it comes to like students, will my children be able to go to university? How much will university cost? What happens to certain policies? What about the housing? There's a lot of questions that I look at when it comes to politics. So when you have these politicians that are in office that can only give you like a 2 or 3 year plan, I feel like we've already failed. Like I want to see, and I understand there's sometimes you get someone in office and maybe they're not the best, but at least we can kind of see how their plan manifests if they have like a 10-year plan. I need someone to come here and say, you know what, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to enact it. We're going to see what happens in these 10 years, and then this is what it's going to be. And I use this as a personal experience. Me, I've lived in the UK since 2012. Yeah, since 2012, I've lived in the UK, and I've actually just applied for another visa. So I am on my fourth visa, and I actually have to apply to another visa. So I will have 5 visas in the UK, and I'm still not a citizen, which I understand that. But every time I have applied for a visa, the amount that it costs has risen like substantially. So I'm just like, there has not been like a 5 or 10 year plan. It's just like, oh yeah, this week we decided that we're gonna increase fees. And I'm like, okay, I get it. I get the economy. You need the money, but what about those 10-year plans? Like for things to change. So that's like, I think I've been here. I went home sometime and then I came back. So I've been here approximately like 7 years. And in those 7 years, I have gotten 4 visas, and every single visa has cost a different amount. So that's when I come back to when it comes to American politics, we need a plan. We need like a 10-year plan. What can we achieve from this? Because right now I think the objective is like, oh, we want to get the current president out of office, which okay, yes. I agree with that. But I'm like, the other candidate, what do you have for us? What can you offer us that's different than him?
Thank you.
I don't know. It's hard to like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
it's just like, I mean, I don't know if there's Trump supporters on here, so I'm just, you know,
no,
not trying to be biased or anything. So, but that's how I feel when it comes to politics.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, yeah, certainly thinking this kind of temporal scale as we think both what's happened in the past and thinking forward as well is really important to kind of navigate things. So for a question from Caroline, following on from Lauren's question, thinking about historical impediments to voting, are there still barriers to voting when it comes to adequate representation of Black communities in the US?
Absolutely. I think one of the case studies that we can look at just recently, I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. I probably should have introduced myself a little bit more, but I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. And I know recently I think it was like 2 years ago, we had an election. I was still in the UK, but I was following everything that was going on in the election. So the other person, it was a Republican, they won the election. So I'm like, okay, fair enough. But the other person, that I feel like they had more, technically they had more votes. They were like, the votes just happened to disappear. Like, I'm confused about that too. I guess there's ghosts. But the votes disappeared because she was in the lead, and then all of a sudden the other person became the governor. And then I'm just like, okay, well, this is interesting. Why is this happening? And in Atlanta, Georgia, it is very predominantly an urban area. So there are a lot of African Americans that live in Georgia, that live in Atlanta, but outside of Atlanta, there's not that many African Americans that live there. So it's a very mixed, I always say it's diverse. It's one of the most diverse places that in America, because I've been to other places, but if you want to see a diverse place, you go to Atlanta. But I'm just like, okay, maybe there are some areas that didn't have access to go to the polls. You got to think about that. Voting is usually held on a Tuesday, the first Tuesday of the month in November. So people that have certain jobs, they couldn't go to the polls. There's just all these things that adds up. And it's like, okay, how can we ensure that people can vote? But I also feel that there's also mistrust in the government. I feel that, oh, a lot of people are kind of just like, if we vote, do our vote really count? I remember growing up and hearing people say that. Does our vote really count? There's also another big factor. We have to look at the demographics. I think when it comes down to it, especially me being African American, we're only less than 20% of the population. So at the end of the day, yes, we can make changes. We can have some type of influence, but we won't have the biggest influence because we're only less than 20% of the population. So that's something to always look at when it comes to voting.
Thank you. So does anyone have any questions that they still would like to ask? I'll just give, you can sit awkwardly for 10 seconds or just kind of in silence, just in case anyone has anything. If you do want to ask a question, maybe just kind of pop a placeholder in there so that we know that there's a longer question coming. Yeah, we can enjoy this silence. It's all very nice.
I think today, like I know I went by really fast. I think today, like you said, has been one of those days because we're here and like, yeah, sorry guys if I was talking a little bit too fast. I know we're just like, I know Boris is gonna go and to give another talk today at 8 o'clock about lockdown. And I was just telling that I was at university. So I literally just got home and just because I had to cover for someone. So it's just been like one of those days and I'm like, I was a little nervous to present. So I do apologize for that. Usually I'm more just like, yes, this, but I was a little bit nervous.
No, thank you so much for coming along, and I'm just glad that the government decided to delay their announcement to allow our session to run as planned.
Oh,
yeah, that was
7.
Yep. Okay, so I think we can probably wrap things up and just say thank you very much. And in fact, hang on, let me just try and do some technical wizardry. Bear with me one moment.
Okay.
I'm just going to try and unmute everyone so that we can give Ashley a quick round of applause and say thank you very much for coming along and for presenting today on something that's really timely, and for also being willing to be the guinea pig doing the first virtual community seminar series. But I think it went brilliantly, and I think it was such an important talk, and I really hope that everybody who came along got as much out of it as I did. So thank you.
Thank you guys for showing up. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so the recording from this will go up on RGU's YouTube channel. So if you fancy revisiting it or recommending it to a friend. Just last thing before we go, we have our next community seminar series event on the 20th of October. It will be the same time. This one will actually be a panel discussion on something that's also really timely. That will be a panel discussion on COVID in the city, and we'll have Colin McFarlane from Durham, Ian Mell from Manchester, and our own Caroline Hood here from RGU, talking about issues around inequality and how COVID has rendered inequality even more visible. So hopefully looking forward to seeing some of you then. And thanks again for coming along on this lovely Tuesday evening. Okay, thanks a lot.